Hey, what's up everybody? It's Mike from Cornfield Customs and welcome back to the Cornfield Customs channel. On this week's episode, we are getting back to the 1946 Mack truck fender build on fender number 2. So stick around as we start blending and planishing out the remaining 3 pieces and getting this fender to come together. Where we left off on the last episode on this fender is we had roughed out all 4 sections. So we have this front section that's roughed out, this piece that's not pictured, and this piece that's not pictured, all roughed out to about this level of shaping. Kind of just putting in the rough shape, and now we can start cleaning that up. And we had started doing all of the blending and planishing on this panel to get it to where it is now. It still needs a little bit. There's a little bit of a flat spot here. I'm pretty sure I mentioned that in the last episode on this fender, but we got to raise that up a little bit. But I want to get the other fender sections to this level first. Once we get them all here, then we can start to final refine all of the imperfections, a little bit of lows, any waves we need, but I want to get them all to this point so we have like a nice standard point of reference. And you know, we're not going to raise this up a little bit and affect something else while we're focusing on getting one of the pieces blended out to this level. Because like even here you can see there's a little bit of a low spot right here. You can see that the way the light breaks. And this is what I'm talking about where I always say I use light. See how that light dips right there where the low spot is and it changes throughout? That area needs work, but I'm not super worried about it at this point because we're going to get the other 3 pieces to this point and then refine from there. So that's what we're going to do first. I'm going to get the power hammer set up and we are going to start blending out all of these rough shrink marks. So just a recap for people that didn't watch the first episode, even though I highly recommend you go and do that. If you don't want to, all of these marks are where we came in with our thumbnail dies in the power hammer and did our initial deep shrinks. So from here, we're going to set the power hammer up with radial tooling, so radial stretch tooling, and it will correspond to the notes that we had written on from our paper pattern. If you're not familiar with paper patterns, make sure to check out some of our patterning videos. It goes into a lot of depth of how we get these notes and dimensions and know where to shrink and or stretch. So we're going to get the power hammer set up, radial tooling, so we can start blending all of this out and getting a nice finish. So let's head over to the hammer. We'll get the tooling put in that we need and get to working on the Mack truck fender. All right, so I'm here at the power hammer and I want to talk a little bit about the tooling we're going to use before we put it in the machine and actually get to work. So we're going to use radial tooling. I've talked about radial tooling in the past, but we'll just do a quick refresh in case you're new to the channel. So radial tooling has a radius. This one's a 24, so it's a 24 in all directions, and it has a contact patch in the middle. So as the upper tool comes down and makes contact with that contact patch, that force is going to stretch in any and all directions, depending on how hard we're having the machine hit. So for what we're doing with just blending and smoothing, we're not going to be trying to stretch that panel out a whole lot. We're just trying to smooth the surface. So it's not going to be doing a ton of stretching, more just blending and smoothing. And that all comes down to how we adjust the stroke on the machine, which we'll get into here in a minute. But like I said, we have the 24-inch radius on the bottom and just a flat upper on the top. And this is going to be about the lowest crown tool that we can use to effectively blend. The main panel in the middle is a 36-inch radius, but with it being steel, it's a little bit harder. So instead of running the hammer harder, where we can actually overwork the material, getting stretch where we don't want it, it's easier to go to a 24 and dial the stroke back, and then we can get into a little bit tighter of the radius. So we're gonna use a 24 and a flat. We'll get that changed out, and then we'll talk about the blending process, the stroke, tool gap, all of that stuff to get the hammer set up. But on a side note, any of these videos, you don't need to have power equipment. You could do all of this with basic hand tools, a tree stump, a mallet, hammers and dollies. But the thing is, here in the shop, This is a business and we need to be efficient and effective with our time. So that's why I use the power hammer, and I don't do a lot of hand tool work, just because it's not fair to my clients that I have a power hammer, but I have to show how to do it all by hand and charge the slower way of doing it with hand tools or not bill at all. I am a business and I'm in business to make money and make a living, so I have to use all the tools at my disposal to be effective and efficient with my time. So that's why I don't do a lot of hand tool work, and we're gonna focus on the power hammer. But like I said, keep in mind, all of this can be done with basic hand tools. We're only shrinking and stretching metal. It's not rocket science. So don't be intimidated that it has to be done on a big machine. You can do it in your home garage. You just have to have a basic understanding of how the metal moves, and it moves the same whether we're using a power hammer or a hand hammer. So enough rambling on this. Let's get over to the hammer, change the tooling out, get it set up, and get to shaping metal. Currently, I have our mid-size thumbnail shrinking dies in from another project I was working on the other day. So we are going to use our wrench here and pop the tooling out. And then we'll take our radial tooling and we'll put the flat top in the top. Make sure it's locked and seated in. And we'll put our 24-inch radius lower in the bottom and make sure it's locked in. Then on this side, there's just a release so we can open up this clamshell. You can see it move there. Then I can push the lower tool post back up into place and we can set our gap. So with the tool post up, I'm going to rotate the hammer around to the bottom of its stroke, and we want about 3/16 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch of tool gap. So this handle here, it adjusts our upper anvil or our ram on the tool height, so we can adjust that. With that set, we're going to set our lower adjuster here, which is our stroke, and we're going to turn it, we're at about 2.5, we're just going to turn it up a little bit to a 3. So the stroke is essentially how hard we're going to hit the hammer. If you have this set at a number 1 stroke, and this is like your hammer stroke here, this is a number 1, and if we adjust it all the way up, this is our stroke. So it's exactly what it sounds like. We're changing the throw or the stroke of the machine to adjust how hard it's hitting. So we're a little bit above halfway on our stroke adjustment, our tool gap set. We got our RPM set, just a little potentiometer here. We're gonna set it at about 35 to 40%. And then we can put our tools back on the tool rack and get the machine turned on, and we are ready to start blending and shaping. The power hammer is all turned on and ready to get going, and we have our roughed in panel here ready to roll. Keep in mind that I said it's radial tooling, so that force of the hammer blow spreads out in any and all directions, just like I mentioned. So it doesn't matter if we're going left to right, in and out, in a diagonal. It's all moving the metal the same because it's radial tooling. I move a bunch of different ways. If I'm trying to get to an area that needs more work, I can focus in that area and then wash outward. So don't worry about trying to focus going left to right, forward or backwards. If you're using radial tooling, it doesn't really affect the panel negatively. Like in a wheel, you can only go forward and backwards and then migrate left to right. With a radial tooling, it doesn't really matter because it is working the metal outward in all directions from the center point of your contact area. So that's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna grab some gloves, hearing protection, and we will get to blending this out. And hopefully in the video, like in the footage, you guys will be able to see this start to get cleaned up a little bit, take all the lumps and bumps out, and get everything blended and cleaned up. Some of the initial blending here in this low crown area and here I got knocked out, but now we have to get into this radius and this radius. So looking at the buck with our Cornfield radius gauge, here is a 6, and then it goes from a 6 to a 4 there in this tight radius. So we have a 6-inch and a 4-inch, and I have a 6-inch radius lower tool for the power hammer, but I do not have a 4-inch radius. So we'll put the 6-inch radius in the hammer, work where we can, and then we'll have to switch over to the air planisher because I do have a 4-inch radius for that. So right here, I'm gonna bring the camera in and show you kind of close up, but I'll show you where the 6-inch lays and then why we can't use this in the 4-inch. Hopefully you guys can see this a little bit better. So right here is about where the 6-inch is. We can check that with our gauge. So right there is the 6-inch, and that's where we'll work with this tool all the way around our radius. Like even here is a 6-inch, but like I said, then we'll have to switch over to the 4-inch for this nice tight radius here. And sometimes you can cheat the radius a little bit. The smaller diameter the tool itself is, you can fudge that radius a little bit. But with a 3-inch tool, it has to be spot on, because if not, we'll dig the corners in and get some tooling marks. But the idea is use the lowest crown lower tool you can, or cheat to get away with, because the lower the crown lower tool, the more surface area you get and the smoother your panel will get. That's why we're not trying to smooth all of this out with, say, a 1-inch radius tool, or even this low crown stuff with the 6-inch, because it'll put little bumps and overstretch that area. You want to use the lowest crown anvil in the area you're working that you can to get the panel as smooth as you can with the tool. So let's get this tooling changed out to a number 6, work the area we can, and then we'll jump over to the air planisher and continue working the tighter radius. All right, we're back at the hammer, so we'll drop the tool post, pull our tool out, and we will go ahead and put our 6-inch radius lower tool in. Recheck our tool gap, and I'm going to turn our stroke a little bit more. Put these back on the rack and we'll get to shaping. So I wanted to show you guys really quick how I know where I need to be working and what radius is what based on our layout on the panel. So here you can see this line. This line here is pretty faint. I think you can see it if the light hits it just right. But there's another line here, and we've got our center punch marks. Yeah, there's a little bit more of the blue line. But it's a 6-inch radius. Like I said, it's kind of hard to see in, I think in the camera because everything's a little faded, but that's how I know where to work. And I'm using this light across the panel to show me if there's any major low spots. And there was a low spot here, and that's why I came in with that 6-inch radius, just to raise that up real quick. This is why it's so critical to leave your layout on here. And as you can see where it's rubbing off, I can come back and we've got our center punch marks here if I can find them. They tend to blend in a little bit until we start cleaning it off. But there's center punch marks on here, so we can lay our pattern back on and lay everything back out if need be. Yeah, like there's one. They're on here, I just gotta wipe everything off. We can use those marks to line everything back up, get the pattern laid back out if our blue original layout marks get rubbed off. And here you can see that the light line's not really perfect. It's kind of wavy through here, but this is also where that 4-inch radius is that I said I can't use on the power hammer. So this is pretty good, rough blended. And now we're gonna switch over to the Milwaukee. So this is the Milwaukee. I'm gonna put a 4-inch radius tool in. Right now it has a 24 with a flat upper. So we'll swap this out, put a 4-inch radius in it, and start cleaning up the main 4-inch radius, blending into the flat here on the outside and up into our 6-inch radius here to get a nice transition. And I'm pretty sure I've said this multiple times in the past. The quick and dirty part of shaping is getting from the laid out blank to this. This is quick and dirty, doesn't take a whole lot of time compared to refining. Refining your panel, getting it to clip fit on the buck, all your light lines dialed in, that is extremely, extremely time consuming and tedious. So one of the good sayings in metal shaping is the last 10% takes 90% of the work, which is very true. The first part, we'll just say the first 10% of roughing stuff out, super quick, super dirty, and you can get it close. But like I keep saying, that last little bit of adjust here, bring the panel down, adjust there, smooth this out, adjust your light lines, all of that stuff is so time consuming, and that's where the majority of your time and your energy goes into. This video is going to be continuing on with that. Hopefully you guys don't find it extremely boring, but it's a lot of the same processes back and forth between the power hammer, the planishing hammer, test fitting to the buck, and repeat as need be to get everything adjusted down while using light to help show us where the imperfections are. So enough babbling. I know I say that all the time. I do tend to ramble on, but we're gonna head back over to the planishing hammer, planish that 4-inch radius, and then we will start test fitting it to the buck to see how things are looking. we are over at our workbench, and here's the panel. I'm gonna go ahead and clean it off with glass cleaner to get some of the oil off, and then we're gonna lay out where our 4-inch radius is just to get fresh layout lines. So let's get this thing cleaned off, and we'll use our pattern to take some measurements, or we could use the buck to take measurements. So either way is fine. And you can see that the panel is kind of twisted up. That's because we're letting some of the form go as we planish and blend. And the form, like I've said in many videos, is just bending. We're not changing the material thickness. We're not changing the surface area of the panel. Form is just bending. And how we can kind of check and verify that, and hopefully you guys can see it from there. I'll rotate this a little bit and you can see we've planished this area or blended with a 6-inch radius tool, and if we put our 6-inch gauge on here, you can see that gap there. It's not quite 6 inches. So that's more of a form issue than anything. And we can check too with our radius gauge that I matched to the buck. So you can see that it looks like it's got too much shape this way, but it's actually form. If we put that 6-inch form back in here, it will tighten this radius up, which will flatten that radius out. So shape and form go hand in hand, and you have to kind of balance that. I talk a lot about that in many of these videos because shape versus form is one of the toughest things to kind of wrap your head around. People get stuck chasing the shape when it's actually a form issue, and then you'll overshape your panel and get to a spot where then you have to undo all of that shape. Putting shape in, whether you're shrinking or stretching, is a lot more work than form, and it will be a lot more work to undo that shape. So I like to err on the side of form versus shape because form is easily done and undone. You're just bending it. So always keep an eye on what the form of the panel is doing before you start going in and adjusting the shape of the panel. So with that cleaned off and me talking gave it a minute to dry, let me grab the pattern. We can take some measurements and put some fresh layout lines on here so we know what needs to be happening. So we've got our patterns here. We'll go ahead and pull those out. This is panel D. So we will look and see which pattern we've got. This is panel A. So we can set that to the side. This one I don't see. So let's see what the other two are. This one is panel B, and this one is panel C. So the unlabeled is panel D. So what I'm gonna do is we're gonna grab a tape measure, and we're gonna measure up from the edge to where the 4-inch light line is. And you can see here it says 6-inch to that line, and then 4-inch here at the edge. So I'm going to measure up what that is, and it is right at 3 1/8. So we'll come in and we're going to measure up 3 1/8. So just for, this isn't the permanent edge, these are just good reference lines. So we're going to take our combination square and line that up. And then we'll kind of mark where that needs to be. And we're going to clean this line up with tape. So it might look a little wonky at this point, but we'll clean it up with masking tape before we make any critical decisions. And here at the end where the panel kind of tapers off, we're going to kind of have to eyeball that as well. So that should follow kind of that profile there. And that's where a little bit of kind of the artistry and you have to interpret things. You know, it's not going to continue that off because it kind of fades out into nothing. So that's where you're going to have to kind of interpret and figure out what needs to happen as you go. So from here, we can start laying out our tape line, and I'm going to put a tape line above and a tape line below, probably a couple bands of tape. I'll probably measure off of the buck and see what that needs to be, and that's how we'll offset on both sides of the line to give us our 4-inch radius, and then we can clean up the line for our 6-inch radius as well. What I did to figure out how much of an offset we need based on that center line is I came in where on our buck, and I found 4-inch, because that's the area we're working in, and I lined this up to where it sits nice and flat here, and then I can rotate that around and it still fits there. So I put a reference mark here and a reference mark there where the radius gauge fits until it starts pulling away. If I go a little bit below that line, you can see it rocks, and then I get it there and it touches. So that gives us the area we're working that is a 4-inch radius. Then I'll come in with our tape measure, and it's right at 3 1/4. So what we can do is we will take 2 bands of 3/4 inch tape on each side of our blue line there, and that'll give us 1.5 inches on each side, 3 inches, and then that'll give us a little bit of about 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch of blending line up into the next radius. So we'll go back to the fender piece and we'll start laying that out with masking tape. Back at our panel, I've got a fresh roll of 3/4 inch masking tape, and I'm gonna come over and line it up approximately where the blue line is. And just like when we're laying out our pattern, we're gonna take the average of this blue line, because it's not perfectly straight, and we just wanna get a nice smooth radius, taking the average of that line we drew with our combination square. And then I'm going to grab some rubbing alcohol on a towel, and we're going to wipe off this kind of cruddy blue line. We'll get it to be nice and even. A little rubbing alcohol on our towel here. And just wipe off that bad blue line. And this goes back into our aiming small, missing small. Now's the time to correct this line. So just get it ironed out, narrow our margin of error, and things will be a lot smoother. So that is off of there. We will do another row of tape, and then we will come back and we will mark this edge of the line, which is going to be our new center line, and then we will do the outside of our 1.5 inch offset, and then we'll come back and do 2 bands of 3/4 inch tape on the inside as well. Now with our tape pulled off, you can see we have an outer, a center, and another outer. Now we're gonna go back to the planishing hammer, and I'm going to focus on this 4-inch radius here, and then we'll come in and I'll put our 6-inch radius in and blend out and start refining a little bit more. And then we can start checking it to the buck, seeing where we need to adjust the form to get this thing to pull down into place. But while we're here, I'm gonna go ahead and just planish this out, blend it, correct some of the light a little bit more, because I know it needs that before we get too carried away with anything else. back over at the work table, you can see that our surface finish is starting to come up. Our light lines are looking a lot better. You can see that just in the reflection, how everything's turning out a lot nicer than when we had started, and it was just kind of roughed in like this. You can see the difference in surface finish and kind of the light lines and lumps and bumps. With that being said, we need to start checking the overall form and shape to the buck at this point. So here is the radius gauge that we had used that fits the buck here. But then if we bring it over and touch it to our fender, well, there's a gap on this side and a gap on that side. And it looks really bad. Looks like it's overshaped. But this is where I was talking about shape versus form. So we'll come in with our radius gauge. We'll go to where the 4-inch was and see how it doesn't really fit, but we were planishing it with a 4-inch radius tool. So we'll also check with the 6, but the 6 isn't there either. So what does that mean? That means our form is incorrect both directions, because we have too much of a radius this way and not enough of a radius this way. So when we go over to the wheeling machine that we'll use to put the form in, we're going to use the rubber coated upper, and we'll match the radius of the lower tool to the radius of the area we're working in. So this will be a 4-inch, this will be a 6-inch. And by adjusting that form with the wheel, it'll tighten this radius up and flatten this radius up a little bit. So it'll correct two things at once. It'll bring our edges outward and bring this over tighter. So that's where keeping an eye on your form and your shape are so critical. You don't want to make rash decisions going one way and cause yourself a bunch of work. So let's head over to the wheeling machine. I've already got the rubber coated upper in there, and we'll have to change out the lower tool for the radius we're going to work on. I'll probably start with a 4-inch radius. So we'll drop this out, put the 4-inch radius tool in, and then we will wheel the form in using this rubber coated upper. So we'll drop the lower tool holder down, and we will get our 4-inch radius lower tool. We will put that in place. We're back the pressure off a little bit because we're just going to creep up on it with light pressure. I also brought over our radius gauge so we can check it as we go. And just for the visualization at this point, here's our 4. We have a little bit of a gap. So I'm going to work between those two lines that we drew out of tape, and we've got our center line and our two outsides. We're going to focus on staying in between those two outside lines and correcting the form. I'll add a little bit more pressure as need be, but we don't want to get too carried away and put tooling marks in our panel. Check our progress to see how it's coming. And I'll lean this up here and I'll grab the camera and show you guys that we're creeping up on it. So just with that little bit of form adjustment, it's starting to get where we need it to be. It needs a little bit more, but you can see that it's closed that gap up quite a bit. So we'll just keep wheeling with the rubber coated upper, adjusting our form. And again, remember, form is not changing the material thickness or surface area. We're just bending. So this gives us a nice uniform 4-inch radius throughout the part. So we'll keep wheeling that to get the form a little bit tighter, and then we'll switch over to a 6-inch radius, repeat that process in the area we have labeled for 6-inch. And then we can start checking it to the buck. Back over at the workbench, our panel is here after we did the form adjustment on the wheeling machine with the rubber coated upper, and then we worked in our 4-inch radius area and our 6-inch radius area with the corresponding tooling. So we have our adjustable radius gauge here, and we're gonna check this, and it's pretty close, but it doesn't quite fit perfect. So I'm not too pressed about it yet because we haven't even test fit it on the buck at this point yet. So it's pretty close with the gauge. There's a little bit of areas where it doesn't quite touch. And then we'll check this with our 4-inch, and the 4-inch fits pretty good. And the 6-inch, it's still a little low. So we could raise that up a little bit, continuing the wheeling, or we might need a little bit more stretch. So before we get too wrapped up in which direction to take, if we should add more shape or just continue to try to adjust the form, let's check it to the buck and see how it looks. So we'll put our panel on the buck, just kind of sit it into place. We'll grab a couple spring clamps just to hold everything. We have to slide. I'm gonna take this other piece off. It's kind of in the way at this point. And this will allow us to slide this section farther up. Put a couple spring clamps on just to hold everything in place. And overall, it's pretty close. This, we have to adjust the form down a little bit. You can see how I can pull that in. But here, I'll move the camera here in a second. There's a little bit of a raise here. And that could be a little bit too much shape. If we shrank too much here, it'll pull this corner out. So by looking at the inside of the buck, it's also pulled away from some of the stations in that same area. Like here it's pretty close, and here it starts to pull away, here it's farther away, here it starts to come back in a little bit. So right where, kind of from here to here, this is pushed out. So to correct that, we're gonna come in and we're gonna do some linear stretching on the power hammer right to this blue line. That's where we had everything laid out before. So coming to that blue line, we'll linear stretch that. It's where we've shrank. So to reverse what we had done with shrinking, we're gonna linear stretch in the same areas. So I'll move the camera, show you guys kind of from this shot and up in the buck what I'm looking at. And just to make the visualization easier, I'm gonna come back in, I'm gonna tape that line off again. So I have a nice bright blue Sharpie mark, and then we'll go to the power hammer and put the linear tool in and linear stretch this. And what that'll do is that'll open this up a little bit, drop this down, and allow this to move inward. And that should correct both of our issues with one simple process. So here, hopefully you guys can see it in the camera, this bows out just a little bit. It's got a little bit of a belly in it. But at this angle through the camera, you can really see that the surface finish is starting to come up on the panel. If we look up in the buck, hopefully you guys can see it, and this is why we have holes in the buck. Bring you over to this one. You can see there's a little bit of a gap here. So there's a gap there. Down here is not as bad. And sorry if this sucks, but it's kind of tough to show. Here it's a little bit better, other than that form issue here at the end that I was talking about. So hopefully that wasn't too terrible to see that, because I couldn't see the screen on the camera. But that's what we need to do, is we will come in and we'll linear stretch this a little bit and get that to relax back out. First things first, we're going to relay out this blue line and a little bit of glass cleaner. Wipe it off so our tape sticks really well. Then once that dries, we'll pull our tape line, and while that's drying, I'll go over and we'll talk about the linear stretch on the power hammer. I went ahead and installed our linear stretch tooling. So I'm gonna use this light here so you can see it. The light reflection is on our high part of the die, which is a line. So as the top tool comes down and makes contact, it's going to spread the force outward from the left into the right of that line, and that gives us a linear, which is gonna take the material and spread it out like that. So it's gonna fan that out, and when we shrink, it brings that in. So we're just going to do the opposite of when we shrank that area. I probably got carried away and over shrank just a little bit, so we'll go in and correct that. Tool post is down at this point, so I'll bring that up, make sure we have our 3/16 to 1/4 inch tool gap like always. We have our stroke is set at about 2 1/4. That should work out all right. So once we get that line on there, we will do a little bit of linear stretching, check it to the buck as we go to verify, and get this corrected. And I'm hoping with this here, you can see, it's kind of tough because it's an arc, but you can see that that's a little high. So that's right where we're gonna take that out. So let's tidy up that line, give ourselves some reference marks, and we will be ready to linear stretch. I came in with our linear tool and I linear stretched this edge, and that dropped this down a little bit and softened this. But what happens is when you change one thing, it changes a bunch of other things. So now we have to come back and clean this radius up with our 4-inch radius in the Planisher. It kind of peaked it. Hopefully you guys can see it there. It's not a 4-inch radius anymore. Let me grab the radius gauge and you can see it. Before, we had a nice 4-inch radius through that area, and now we have this peak. So I have to go back over to the air Planisher with our 4-inch radius lower tool, blend that out again, and then I can check to repeat. So again, this is why it's so time consuming, because you run into one little issue that you need to adjust the shape, and it could take you a few steps back to get corrected and then come back to where you left off. So I'm gonna head back over to the Planishing hammer. We'll smooth that radius out, blend it back into a 4, and check it back on the buck. With all of this blended back out on the Planishing hammer again, now we get to head back to the wheeling machine and repeat the process for fine-tuning our 4-inch radius, blending up into our 6-inch radius. Once we get that form corrected again, we can test it to the buck, see where we're at, and then adjust accordingly from there as need be. And this is where I said it's going to be a lot of back and forth, fine tuning, taking the form out, adjusting the shape, putting the form back in, correcting things, and test fit, test fit, test fit. Again, it's really long, drawn out, and tedious work, but this is really what makes your work stand apart, is that you're focusing on getting everything to fit the buck really nice, all the shapes to flow, your light lines to flow, and everything be as it should on the part, not just cutting corners or stopping early before you get to a finished part. So I'm going to head over to the wheeling machine, get this form corrected, and we can jump back and test it to the buck. With a fresh test fit on the buck, everything seems to fit a lot better. It still needs some work, but here, this plane is a lot flatter, and I want to show you, hopefully we can see it, but if you look in this buck station, it fits really tight up against the buck here, and hopefully you guys can see it here. It fits pretty tight there. But I want to talk to you about something, and this is kind of, some people might agree with it, some people don't. But the thing with handmade bucks is the buck isn't going to be perfect. And I would rather shape a panel to look right, have the right flow, constant radius where needed, and look the part instead of touching the buck. So kind of why I'm mentioning that is we are touching this station on that side, this station on that side. This looks pretty good except for right there, which I'm going to address that here in a minute, but it touches here, 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 here. Most of the stations, this plane looks pretty decent, but it doesn't quite touch two of our stations. So there you can see a little bit of a gap, and there is good. And there's a little bit of a gap. So with that being said, it doesn't touch all the stations equally, but to get this panel to touch those stations, it would have to dip down here in this radius, so it would dip down to touch the stations, and then dip back up to come back and touch these stations. Well, looking at it with the light and the reflection, like it's not 100% perfect yet, but to get it to do that is not going to look right. You know, the fender should have a nice